hoping that you will continue to stay sugared up throughout the course of the evening. So if you need another brownie or raspberry bar or lemon bar, please feel free to get one. If you need to take one on your way out, please feel free to get one. The Department of Religious Studies believes strongly in food. So for religious and other reasons, so I'd like you to leave feeling like you've had some nice food with us. So our plan tonight is to have Professor Bullitt speak for 30 to 45 minutes, depending on how the mood strikes him. And then we'll have around 15, 20, maybe 25, depending again on the timing of minutes for questions. So if you need to leave after the talk, or after the first few questions, that's fine. We're happy to have you as long as you have time for. We'd love to have you for the whole evening, but we're happy to have you for part of it. For those of you who don't know me, who are not, for example, my students, I'm Andrea Stanton. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Religious Studies, and I'm also our undergraduate advisor. We're a very active department in terms of research and events and teaching, and we obviously, given the important role that religion plays in the world, we have a lot to say about current events. And so with that in mind, we are very delighted to have Professor Bullitt with us on campus. We'd like to thank the Marsico Visiting Scholars Program for making his visit possible, and we'd like to thank our co-sponsors, the Center for Middle East Studies, which as many of you know is a new but very active and important part of the University of Denver, and also the Department of History. If you don't know where you've been, it's hard to know where you're going, so the Department of History is also very important. It's now my great pleasure to introduce my former advisor, and much more importantly, world-renowned scholar Richard Bullitt. He is professor of history at Columbia University. He for years directed the Middle East Institute there. He's been a Carnegie Scholar. He's been a Guggenheim Fellow. He has been awarded nearly every named fellowship in the world, including the Fulbright Hayes and the Woodrow Wilson. He served as the Executive Secretary of the Middle East Studies Association. He serves on the Board of Trustees of the Columbia University Press. He's a good guy to know. He's also the author. We had a discussion about this at dinner. How many scholarly books have you written? We're around 10 is what we're concluding based on various, how you define scholarly books. He wrote the very groundbreaking Patricians of Nishapur, Conversion to Islam in the Medieval Period, Islam, the View from the Edge, The Case for Islamo-Christian Civilization, which some of my students read part of for today, and Cotton, Climate, and Camels in early Islamic Iran. He's also edited several world history textbooks, as well as the Columbia History of the 20th Century. And just to make things fun, he also writes novels in his spare time. So it is, again, my very great pleasure to welcome Richard Bullitt on behalf of the Religious Studies Department and our co-sponsors. We do, as part of the Marsico program, I will be handing out surveys. So they're color-coded. If you are the student type, please take the lavender. If you are the non-student type, please take the lovely shade of blue. But we are very interested in assessing how this program works in terms of intellectual engagement. So I will hand those out, but in the meantime, please join me in welcoming Professor Bullitt for his talk on religion and the state in Islam, from the medieval Caliphate to the Muslim Brotherhood.
Well, thank you, Andrea. Thank you all for coming this evening. This is first time in 40 years I've been in Denver, and my niece lives here, and now that I've found my way to her house, I'm sure I will come many times again, particularly if this lecture works this evening. So we'll see. The topic deals with religion and government. And I'm going to produce for you a series of conceptual statements that are not at all obvious and try and show how they link together. First, let me introduce the topic of the history of the Muslim South. We sometimes talk about the global South as sort of a conceptual tool to talk about poor countries as opposed to rich countries. The Muslim South is something like that. It's just a term I've invented. And it refers to every place in the world where Muslims live that is south of the latitude of Medina, where the Prophet lived. If you draw that line, you'll find that half of the Muslims in the world live in the Muslim South, at least half, because that includes Bangladesh, Indonesia, West Africa, East Africa, Sudan, so forth. If you think then of the Muslim North, the areas to the north of that line of 25 degrees north latitude, there you get North Africa, Egypt, the Middle East, northern India, Afghanistan, Central Asia, Turkey, and so on. If you look at the scholarship that is done, you'll find that there are 10 books on the Muslim North for every book on the Muslim South. Now, part of the reason for this is that the Muslim South was an area, not entirely defined this way, but it was an area to which Islam spread comparatively late. So that, let us say, at least half of the Muslims in the world today are the descendants of people who converted to Islam after the year 1300. And most of them live in the Muslim South. There are some other areas, such as Southeast Europe and China and Central Asia, that have late conversion phases. But what it means is that the Muslim South did not share in the early medieval history of the Islamic Empire. And yet today, many of the most important developments in the Islamic world are ones that are taking place in the Muslim South. And people tend not to have a very good feel for that, because they think Islam means Arabia and Muhammad and big conquests and then a caliphate, that is to say an empire ruled by a caliph. None of that happened in the Muslim South at that time. It was all much later. That later period of Islam tends to be neglected partly, I say this from a scholarly angle, partly because there's a very widespread feeling expressed in literature and sometimes in political statements that Islam stagnates after 1300 and that it becomes sort of ossified and non-creative, and that all of the really important stuff in Islam was earlier than that. But in fact, the period after 1300 was incredibly successful. It may not have produced the philosophers or the legal thinkers, but it won souls. And in particular, the areas in which Muslims came into contact with and competition with Christians, because after 1300 is when you get into the period of European exploration and then colonial settlement in various parts of the world, Islam becomes identified in many areas with opposition to European colonialism or European imperial penetration. So that where Christianity and Islam come face to face in the post-1300 world, by and large, Christianity loses. This doesn't mean that Christianity doesn't grow in that period, but it grows principally in the Western Hemisphere, where there are no Muslims, or in the southern half of Africa, let us say south of Nigeria, where Islam was not really around. So Islam is incredibly successful during the period when much of our scholarly literature says that Islam was stagnant and unsuccessful. So why does the literature get that wrong? Well, it's partly because there is a great change in the nature of Islam at a political level that begins in the around 1200, a little bit before, and is pretty much fully realized after 1300. And this has to do with the disappearance of the primary theme that Muslims interested in, or Muslims organizing political life had focused on from the time of the Prophet's death in 630 AD down to that period, and that is to say, political dominion. What was the focus of political dominion? Ever since the death of the Prophet, there has been a concern about who succeeds to the position of the Prophet Muhammad, since it is understood religiously that there can be no further prophet. Muhammad is the last of the messengers of God. So who can succeed him as the leader of the community? This notion of a caliph pops up almost immediately. And there's a parallel notion of an imam. Both of these are conceived of as leaders of the community. Sometimes people will think, well, the caliph and the imam are or should be the same thing. Sometimes they think that they are separable. But these are supposed to be the political and spiritual leaders of the community. Prior to 1200, almost all of the political movements that you get in the Islamic world focus on who is going to be the caliph or the imam. And then there is the development of a subordinate title, sultan. Literally in Arabic, it's a word that means power, and it initially refers to the actual temporal ruling power of the caliph. So the earliest appearances of this term refer to the sultan of the caliph. It's an attribute of the caliphate. And then starting at the end of the 900s, you begin to get it separated. So you have a caliph who has spiritual power, and he delegates his worldly power to a sultan. Over time, the term sultan grows in importance. And you have theories that say, well, you can achieve the sultanate by delegation from the caliph, or simply by seizing power, and then writing him a letter and letting him know. So people would write to the caliph saying, you know, I've just conquered northern India, please name me the sultan, and he would write back and say, gee, I'm really impressed. You're now the sultan of northern India. But the theoretical concern that shows up in the books of philosophy, the books of law, books on political practice, focuses on this question of imam and caliph, and to a lesser degree, sultan, and assumes that there is someone conceived of in some fashion who is rightfully, at any given point in time, the head of the Muslim community. After 1300, down to the 1920s, or maybe a little bit earlier, this concern disappears. There's almost no, particularly in Sunni Islam, there's almost no discussion of who the caliph is after 1300. Now, in strictly political terms, in the year 1258, there was a Mongol invasion of the Middle East, the second Mongol invasion. The city of Baghdad, where the caliph ruled, he had pretty much total jurisdiction in Baghdad and in the city, just pretty much in the city limits. I mean, by that time, he'd lost almost all of his power. But the Mongols sacked the city of Baghdad. They took the caliph, rolled him up in a rug, and had him trampled to death by horses, because they thought it was bad to spill the blood of a ruler. But if it's soaked up in the rug, is a sort of pate form of execution. So then, after 1258, you don't have a caliph. 2 years later, some generals in Egypt find a relative of the last caliph and put him on a throne in Egypt and say he's the caliph. And nobody pays any attention to him. So that from 1260 down to 1517, you have a nominal caliph that is of seemingly of very little importance. And then after 1517, the title goes virtually unused until the end of the 19th century. So politics changes at a very fundamental level. You don't have people who are debating what individual has the divine right or the divine authorization to put himself forward as a leader of the Muslim community. Now, in Shiite Islam, you have a variant of this where the notion of an imam continues, but the imam that the Shiites are concerned about is invisible. He had disappeared around the year 873, and it's assumed down to the present day that he will return. He is called the hidden imam, and that anyone who rules as a Shiite is ruling in his absence, not with his authorization, but simply in his absence. And his blessed return can occur at any moment. While he is in occlusion, he is not disappeared. This is not dying and being resurrected, but rather he is living somewhere. And as some Shiites argue, he is leading the world in the way that the sun warms the earth when it's behind a cloud, that his presence is still central. But exactly where he is living isn't known, although if you Google hidden imam and Bermuda Triangle, you will find a number of people who have posted theories that that is where he is, that he's out of the Bermuda Triangle, and that he isn't. Okay, let me just get clear. I'm not endorsing that view. So what is it that politics revolves around in this post-1200 world, and why? And how does it relate to this idea of the Muslim South? Well, the starting point in trying to explain this is the great Muslim hero of the time of the Crusades, Saladin, Salahuddin in Arabic, a great Kurdish general who drove the Crusaders out of Jerusalem in the year 1187. After driving the Crusaders out of Jerusalem, a great triumph because they had held Jerusalem for about 75 years at that point, more than 75, more like 90 years. He sent a message to the Caliph in Baghdad, because you still had it, 1187, Caliph disappears in 1258. He sent a message to the Caliph in Baghdad saying, my pious and noble soldiers have driven the unbelievers out of Jerusalem. We have retaken the holy city. And the Caliph wrote back and said, actually, those are the pious and noble soldiers of the Caliphate, not yours. And Salahuddin wrote back and said, actually, they're mine, because the Caliph in Baghdad had not lifted a finger to fight against the Crusaders since the beginnings of the Crusades in the 1090s. And Salahuddin felt he was being dissed by the Caliph. A few years later, we have an inscription that appears, and I can't remember the exact date. It's in the 1190s. And in it, Salahuddin is presented as, he gives his title, his name, and then it says he is the master of the Haram al-Sharif, the noble shrine, which is the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem. And he is the servitor of the two holy places, Khadim al-Haramain, the two holy places being Mecca and Medina. And this term, Khadim al-Haramain, this becomes the core political concept of Islam for the post-1300 era. Now, there may have been some use of the term by the caliph prior to this time. But if a caliph said that he was the servitor of Mecca, Medina, then he was simply describing one of his functions as caliph. When Salah ad-Din says that he is the servitor of the two holy places, he is essentially usurping a crucial function of a Muslim ruler that had previously been exercised by the caliph. And he is not claiming to be the caliph, but he's claiming to do the caliph's job in a very important way. Late in the year of 1187, during the pilgrimage, which comes at the end of the year, there's a pilgrimage caravan that went from Syria with a general appointed by Salah ad-Din to lead the caravan. And there was, as there always was every year, a big caravan that went from Baghdad with a caravan leader appointed by the caliph. So these two caravans of pilgrims are homing in on Mecca. And they get there, and they observe the rituals that are performed outside the city limits of Mecca. And then after you do those, then the pilgrims go into Mecca to perform other rituals at the at the Kaaba in the city. So the commander of the Syrian caravan gets up, tells the drummers to drum the pilgrims together because they're going to leave to go into Mecca. And then the leader of the Iraqi caravan, appointed by the caliph, says, no, the Iraqi caravan goes first. And the Syrian says, no, we're ready to go now. And there's no reason why we shouldn't go first. So then the two groups of pilgrims, these hundreds of pious Muslims who have traveled sometimes for weeks or months to get to Mecca, they go to war against each other. And they're killing each other and they're fighting and so forth over the question of who has priority for going into Mecca. The Syrian commander suffers a mortal wound. And then the Iraqi commander, according to the one chronicle that discusses this in detail, says, well, maybe I picked a bad time and place for this confrontation. Now, there are other instances later on in history of competition over and conflict over who gets priority going into Mecca. But this is the one that is occurring right after the confrontation between Salah ad-Din and the caliph over, who is the guy who is most important here. And it's after this that Salah ad-Din makes tremendous changes in the way the pilgrimage is conducted. He basically, Mecca is in a barren valley and has to be supported by food brought in from the outside. And it has had a hereditary governor who was a descendant of Muhammad. But in order to pay for Mecca, which is actually at that time, circa 1175, it probably didn't have more than 5,000 or 10,000 full-time residents. You couldn't live there. It was just a barren place. So the way you would pay for all these stuff was there was a tax on the pilgrims. And it was a pretty sizable tax, so that poor people really couldn't make the pilgrimage because there was a tax. And then the money collected for the pilgrims was used to pay for the supplying of Mecca and Medina. Saladin eliminated the tax and basically took over as a government function the support of Mecca and Medina. And he controlled Jerusalem. I think this is really the first time in Islamic history where the three holy cities come to be linked in a single conceptual framework as the people, as the places that are central to Islam. In the following years, between, say, 1200 and 1400, Mecca becomes a major center. Never had been before. We know very little about anyone who ever went to Mecca and stayed, because there was no place to stay. You would go, you would spend a few days, do your rituals, and you go home. Now, for the first time, people build schools in Mecca. They build convents for mystic brotherhoods in Mecca. We know of, say, some 75 institutions where people could actually now stay. And they might stay for years and study there. And Mecca becomes an educational center, which it never was before. And all of this is under the patronage, ultimately, of the Khatam al-Haramain. He is the person who is credited with making this pilgrimage center flourish. And the pilgrimage becomes, I would argue, the replacement for the Caliphate as a central conceptual political entity in Islam. Up to that time, before 1258, even though it had lost power, Muslims thought that, well, there is a political institution of the Caliph or the Imam. That is the center of Islam. Now they're saying the pilgrimage as this ritual site and this holy city, this is the center of Islam. And the person who is in charge of it is therefore de facto the central political figure in Islam, even though he makes no claim to be a caliph and no claim to be an imam. For one thing, Salahuddin, all of the Muslim tradition says that the imam and the caliph should be Arabs. Salahuddin was not an Arab. He was a Kurd. And the people who rule in the Middle East from 1200 onward are almost all Turks or Kurds or anything but Arabs. The Arabs really quit having much political power after 1200. But you could be Khatam al-Haramain. You could be the servitor of the holy places, regardless of your ethnic background. And you didn't have to have any spiritual claim to descent from the prophet or anything like that. And so you see this transformation in this ritual. It takes various forms that have not really been noticed very much. For example, people start to be called Haji. You go to a pilgrimage, you come back, the pilgrimage is called the Hajj. And so you come back and from now on you call yourself Haji or El Hajj. All the way from Morocco to India, Morocco to Indonesia, you have people who are saying, I am Haji. In many of these places, particularly in the late converting areas of the Muslim South, this gives them a very important social position. So when you go back home, they can wear different clothes, decorate their house differently, use the title Haji, be considered a particularly pious and important Muslim, whereas before 1200, the title isn't used. One of the interesting carryovers is that the title becomes so important that Christians start to use it for making the pilgrimage to Jerusalem. So in Greek and Serbian, you have to this day certain surnames like Haji Athanasiou or Haji Georgiou, Haji Demetriou, where pilgrim is built into the name. It means that some ancestor made the pilgrimage to Jerusalem. So then you have a new genre of literature, which is writing pilgrimage accounts. We have hundreds of these from India, from Morocco, not so many from the central Middle East, of people they go, they perform the pilgrimage, come back, and then they tell the story of their pilgrimage. And this gives them status. This status that comes from a new title In some cases, you actually have Hod certificates. One of the earliest examples of printing is before you had printing in Europe, before Gutenberg, you actually had printed Hod certificates in Syria, where suitable for framing. You could go on the pilgrimage, come back, get your Hod certificate signed by some mosque leader, and then they would issue you some very small magnets, and you put it on the wall of your refrigerator, and this was your way of showing status. There are so many manifestations of the importance of pilgrimage, and yet we do not have any comprehensive history of the pilgrimage, because in the north, the politics are thought of as being determined by sultans and empires and so forth, and it isn't as noticeable in the north. But in the south, where people are converting to Islam, one of the things you do when you convert to Islam is that you make the pilgrimage. Some of the most famous events associated with pilgrimage are like the pilgrimage of the 14th century of Mansa Musa from West Africa, who goes to Cairo on his way to Mecca and brings so much gold with him that it sort of ruins gold prices for the next generation. It's because the pilgrimage is a terribly important thing. So the rulers of Egypt who come to power after 1260, after the end of the Caliphate, are a bunch of Turkish generals. Well, actually, just one at a time. And they are slaves. They originate as military slaves. The word in Arabic is Mamluk. The chief Mamluk takes the title of Sultan, but all of the Mamluk sultans use even more the title Khadim al-Haramain. And they take over from the family of Saladin, they take over this function of controlling and building the holy places in Mecca and Medina. They keep this until 1517, when Egypt and Syria are conquered by the Ottoman Empire. At that point, the Ottoman Sultan takes the title Khadim al-Haramain. Now the Ottomans take over in Mecca, Medina. And this is symbolically so important for the Ottomans that they destroy all of the schools and all of the convents in Mecca and build new ones themselves, because they don't want anyone else credited with being a patron of learning and religion in the holy places. Now, what this means is that from this time onward, from 1200s onward, when Muslims go on pilgrimage, regardless of where they come from, the one thing that they perceive politically is that the person who is running things in Mecca, Medina, is the central political figure in Islam. He's not a caliph, he's not an imam. More often than not, he's a Turkish general, or under the Ottomans, a Turkish sultan. But the pilgrimage becomes the center of Islam. And particularly for people in the Muslim South who never lived under the Caliphate, who are converting later, this is the history they know. All right, you carry this forward, and you find the importance. There's actually a very good book on the history of the pilgrimage in the Ottoman Empire, if anyone wants to read it, by Soraya Faruqi. But you carry it forward, and you find that the issue of what constitutes political rule in Islam is influenced more by control of the holy places than by anything else. So that in the 1980s, the king of Saudi Arabia dropped his previous title and took the title Khadim al-Haramain, which is now the principal title of the king of Saudi Arabia. And the reason why, totally irrespective of oil, Saudi Arabia is thought by so many Muslims to be the center of Islam, because the king of Saudi Arabia is the patron of the holy places and has torn down every old building and replaced it with buildings built by Saudi contractors, particularly the Bin Laden family, who became enormously important as the contractors in Mecca for the royal family. Because the idea is that the pilgrims are overwhelmed by one political presence. The pilgrimage itself is multi-ethnic, multilingual, come all over the world, but the political presence in the pilgrimage is one. And that's the center of Islam. Now, let me digress a bit and talk about the nature of Muslim political theory. And this is not specifically related to Mecca and Medina, but I will show you the connection in a bit. Muslim political theorists felt that anarchy was the worst of all possible situations, and that if you did not have a government, anarchy would result. In other words, they had a view very much like Thomas Hobbes, that you have a state of nature, the war of all against all, and therefore you had to have a government. Then they also had the notion that governments tend to become tyrannical because there's no restraint. And in this they are, again, rather like Thomas Hobbes and in his work Leviathan. So the political thinking in the West and the political thinking in Islam isn't that far apart. The idea is that you can't have anarchy, you must have a ruler, but rulers tend to become tyrants. So the question you had in both the West and in Islam is, what prevents the ruler from maximizing his tyranny? In the West, what evolved over time was the idea that popular assemblies, parliaments, congresses, and so forth, exercising control over the financial resources of the ruler, they could constrain the ruler. This is the French Revolution and various things subsequent to that. So that the rise of popular government is directly related to this question of how do you curtail tyranny. An alternative would have been to say that the church could curtail tyranny. And if you go back to medieval Christianity, Catholic Church, they had a legal system, and the Pope claimed in the 11th century, say, that he was the ruler of all of Christendom, and that every king should kiss his ring, at the very least. This was a huge struggle between the church and secular rule, called the investiture struggle, in which ultimately the papacy lost. Then came the Protestant Reformation, and you had 100 years of war between Protestants and Catholics. And at the end of that struggle, in the middle of the 1500s, you had a resolution that said that within any country, the ruler may be a tyrant, and he can impose his religion on everyone in the country, but he cannot have any jurisdiction that stretches beyond the boundaries of the country. We have fixed boundaries, we have legal jurisdictions. The idea of a universal religious law, which had been the bedrock of Catholic thinking 200 years earlier. The notion of a universal Christian law is abandoned in favor of a law for each country, sometimes Protestant, sometimes Catholic, but no jurisdiction stretches beyond the boundaries. So when it came to a theoretical instrument for limiting tyranny, religious law had lost its opportunity because it could not stretch broadly. But this never occurred in the Islamic world. So that the Muslim theorists said, what limits the tyranny of the ruler is Islamic law. And every ruler must enforce at least some Islamic laws. And they were sometimes very frank in saying, well, maybe they only have to enforce one law. But they had to enforce some Islamic law. This was based on the concept that before God, all believers are equal, and that the Sultan or the Khadim al-Haramain is no different from the peddler in the street when it comes to prayer, when it comes to standing before God, and when it comes to being subject to the religious law. Now, did this prevent tyranny? Well, no, it didn't prevent tyranny. And yet, in some ways, it was more effective than it appears, because we certainly had despotic, tyrannical Muslim rulers for hundreds of years, but usually they simply terrorized their own families or the people in the court. And if you had a sultan who, cut the head off his favorite, cut his favorite concubine's head off and, threw her body in the Bosphorus, well, that was a misbehavior. But it didn't undermine the fundamental acceptance of the idea that Islamic law is the law of the society. That might not be easy to credit, but let me take a purely imaginary hypothetical situation in which, say, an American president sexually misbehaves with an aide in a closet off the Oval Office, just theoretically. Americans might say, well, that is personal misbehavior, but it doesn't undermine the law of the land. And the fact of the matter is, more and more scholarly studies are showing that Islamic law was perceived as and functioned as the law of the land for Muslims and non-Muslims alike, administered in a comparatively equitable fashion. And we have studies about what happens when Muslims sued Christians and vice versa. It appears to be quite equitable, according to the documents we have, so that the Islamic law at the level of social order actually did, it seems, support the idea of an orderly society, a non-anarchic society, regardless of the misbehavior of the ruler. Now, nevertheless, rulers thought this was a really bad plan because, being rulers, they wanted to be tyrants. So the conceptual situation was that in order to increase their capacity to be absolute rulers, they had to get rid of Islam. In the course of the 19th century, so-called modernizing or westernizing regimes, particularly in Egypt and the Ottoman Empire, and later on a bit in Iran, they started to push Islam, religious things, to the margins. They replaced the religious law, they replaced the educational system, and they became very much more like European states, and with the strong encouragement of the European powers at the time, who were perfectly happy to see Islam degraded and minimized because they had hated Islam for many centuries. So what should have happened, according to Islamic political theory, is that Islam is expelled from the political arena and from the central functions of society. Tyranny should have increased. Now, what actually happened is precisely that. By the 1950s, the largest collection of tyrannical regimes in the world were in the Muslim Middle East, where you had coups and military dictators who all said, we are secular nationalists. We have nothing to do with Islam. We are really progressive Western-style dictators, just like Mussolini and Hitler and Franco. I mean, basically you had Islamic fascism under the guise of secular nationalism. Now, what should have happened, according to Muslim political theory, is that as tyranny increases, the Muslim population has a sort of atavistic, instinctual sense to turn to religion to correct the imbalance. So what you should have had, as the tyrannies increase, is a growth of Muslim political movements, religious movements, that are bent on trying to limit tyranny and introduce religious government. What actually happens is precisely that. This is where you get the Muslim Brotherhood. This is where you get the various groups that have functioned in the Middle East to support the concept of Islamic government ever since the 1930s. And this plays a role in the Arab Spring, because these are the groups that are real or potential beneficiaries of the Arab Spring. So looked at it from this point of view, not from the point of view of them being terrorists or assassins, something like that, but from the point of view of them being a natural and almost programmed response by Muslim populations to increasingly tyrannical dictatorial regimes, then you raise the question of, are these good or bad? And this is the situation that we have today. This situation arose, that is to say, a situation where you had Muslim political movements that were seeking to undermine dictatorships and use whatever tools were available to do so. Some of those tools, for some of the groups, became revolutionary and terroristic. For most of the groups, what they wanted was elections. And they were saying, let us get rid of the dictator and have elections instead, and then maybe we'll be elected and maybe we'll be the government. The first awareness of this in the American policy arena came with the Iranian Revolution of 1979. This is the most earth-shaking event in Middle East studies that there has ever been, because despite the fact that a number of my friends say, oh, if they'd only asked me, I could have predicted what was going on in Iran, they are lying. I knew in 1978-79, I knew everybody in this country who was a specialist on Iran, because I was one myself. And to the best of my knowledge, there are only two people who are actually talking about Islamic political activism as being the main center of what was going on in the Middle East. Hamid Algar at Berkeley and me. We were the ones who said, this is the important stuff, it's the Islamic politics. This message, saying that Islamic politics was normal, and no matter how imperfect in its conception of government, it might be the only way you could get elections instituted, was to actually let these people participate. But after the Iranian Revolution, the tyrannies cracked down, threw the leaders of these groups in prison, and they outlawed religious political parties. And by and large, this repression of the Islamic alternative was supported by governments in America and Europe. People who gave speeches like this one, saying that maybe Islamic politics should be given a chance, were pretty much ostracized from many policy circles. Nobody ever asked my opinion for the next 20 years in the government. And it was only, it came very slowly. So that in 1992, when you had the first Arab Spring in Algeria, you had an election. Muslim groups in favor of elections were going to win the election, so there was a coup, and the army took over and reinstated a military dictatorship. And you got a very strong support from France and tacit support from the United States that this is the thing to do. Let the dictators suppress the Muslim activists. The result was a civil war that killed 100,000 people. There was no publicity at that time about, oh, isn't this terrible? You have a civil war and you have hundreds of thousands or tens of thousands of people being killed in Algeria. All of the things that you see now about, humanistic concerns for Syria, they were not raised in Algeria because it was a different moment. We were not recognizing the possible legitimacy of Islamic politics. So the interesting comparison is between 92 and 2011, where you have similar things going on, and Europe and the United States, they decide to stay out and let the governments fall, and then let the chips fall where they may. Now the chips have been falling for the last 2 years, and you have many people who are becoming extremely upset over the support being given by the people in various countries for groups like the Muslim Brotherhood, for the Islamic political figures. My view is that if these groups form the government, they will probably be inept, and they'll probably, if there's an election, be thrown out of office, and they will have had their chance. But the important thing isn't who rules, it's whether you have elections. It's the institution of elections, repeated year after year, that transforms things. And this can be interrupted by coups, and we can interrupted by this, that, and the other thing. But the important thing is that the Muslim groups all favor elections. I remember in 1992 I published a speech I gave in which I said that I thought that in some year, not in the not too distant future, all the Arab regimes would fall at the same time because the Muslim groups would grow strong enough and important enough to challenge the dictatorships. Now, let me bring this back to where I started this question of Caliphate versus Khadim al-Haramain. Okay, we don't have a formula for how Islam should enter government today. There are some groups that say, let us bring back a caliphate. Let us have one person who rules the entire Muslim world and goes to war against the West. These are fringe groups. Some of them are truly crazy. One, for example, I've been reading about just recently is led by a Scotsman, convert to Islam, named Abdul Qadir as-Sufi al-Murabit, who says there should be a caliphate and it should go onto the gold standard. So he has started minting gold dinars to be the currency of the new caliphate. And you can invest in those and put them in your 401k, and it'll just be a wonderful decision you make. The caliphate is not going to return. But you have some groups that want to see it return. Then you have the Islamic Republic of Iran. That's a religious government. On the other hand, it is a religious government that none of the Sunnis are interested in. They feel that the concept of an Islamic republic governed by a supreme leader has shown itself to be unworkable and to be something for the Shiites but not for us Sunnis. So that doesn't work. So then you have groups like the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood exists in many different countries in sort of national chapters. So Hamas is the Muslim Brotherhood of Palestine. The Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, the Ikhwan, was the founding Muslim Brotherhood. You have a Muslim Brotherhood in Kuwait, Muslim Brotherhood in Pakistan. But it's not a system. It's like each group forms a political party and then seeks to have elections in which they can stand for election. And they don't have any concept of how to govern because they've never governed before. So you have this very interesting situation where you have people who have the potential to win elections and who are interested in having an Islamic government, but they have no model of what an Islamic government would be, because they can't be Khadim al-Haramain. The king of Saudi Arabia has that locked up. So they can't be that. They can't be an imam. They can't be a caliph. What is the alternative? And this is the unsolved question at the present time. One direction things could go would be to have Islamic government in one country. So you'd have an Islamic government here, an Islamic government there, without them being linked together in any way. So a government in Malaysia would be oriented toward Islam and what in Egypt would be, but they might be fraternal and sympathetic to one another, but they don't form a system. You don't have an Islamic government in a broad sense. Another arena is people who think of a kind of overreaching or overarching body that could in some way coordinate Islamic governments in different places. And the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, which has, it's the second largest national membership organization in the world after the United Nations, they have something of an aspiration to do this. Member nations give money to support the OIC, and yet the OIC is based in Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia gives most of the money. So that seems to be more a prescription for indirect Saudi control than anything else. Then there's a question of money. Is there some way to control the flow of money into political systems in other countries? In other words, we do not like or permit foreign money to come into our country to finance our election campaigns. Well, will you have Muslim governments that feel so concerned about their country that they don't want foreign money coming in? Because right now there's a huge flow of money from Saudi Arabia and the Gulf that is slanting the direction of Islamic politics in a variety of countries in a number of different directions. So what I'm saying here is that you had a 5 centuries, 6 centuries of Islam where the real concern was some sort of divine theory of an individual who would be the head of the faith community and the head of the state, caliph or an imam. That comes to an end in the 13th century, and it's followed by more a functional sort of leadership, in which the rulers may be generals who have nothing to do with an Arab background, but the most important one will be controlling the holy cities, and Khadim al-Haramain becomes your crucial title. But now we're in a new era where you have Muslim groups whose rise to prominence is understandable, but what they're going to do with it is very, very uncertain, and if you talk to them, they'll more or less be the first to tell you that they don't know where things are going to go or how this is going to work. Usually they'll simply, well, time is our ally. Time is our side. Well, that's sort of like, putting off paying down the national debt or something. I mean, at some point, kicking the can down the road doesn't work. So we're at a particularly important and interesting time in the history of Islam, totally apart from the issues of terrorism or oil or American neo-imperialism, if you want to call it that. This is a very interesting thing in Islam. And Muslims everywhere in the world are becoming deeply engaged in how to deal with this. And since I am not a Muslim, I am not going to tell them how to do it. And they're not going to ask me. But that's just fine. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It's around 8 o'clock now, so if you need to go, for example, if you're a student or someone else, or it's your bedtime, like those of us who turn into pumpkins early, I obviously won't be leaving, but I do turn into a pumpkin early, then please feel free to leave. Again, feel free to grab something sweet on your way out. Otherwise, we can take questions for maybe 10 to 15 minutes so that we don't overtax Professor Bullett's stamina. So I'll let, do you want me to field the questions? Or
Yeah, you can go ahead.
Questions? Yes.
I was wondering if you could speak to the government in Turkey and what your impressions are about them, because they've been in power for, I think, the better part of a decade, and I think they've had some success in terms of managing the economy and managing
Yeah, Turkey is a very, very interesting case study for everyone who's not Arab. The Arabs don't like Turks, and therefore they refuse to take any guidance from the Turks. The first democratic elections in Turkey, that is to say, competitive elections between political parties, occurred in 1950. That government was overthrown by the military in 1960. Then you had a military coup in 1970, a coup in 1980, a semi-coup in 90. And so what we've had in Turkey is that the military has continually monitored civilian government. And every time you've got a deviation from what the military sees as being acceptable, they have felt free to step in. Several times you've had religious parties, either openly or covertly, participating in these elections. And only with the election of the AK Party a decade ago did you actually have a religiously oriented party taking over, although it's sort of a very moderate type of Islam. Very cleverly, the party made itself the primary exponent of the idea that Turkey should join the EU. And this stymied the military, because joining the EU, becoming part of Europe, was extremely popular in Turkey. And the military did not want to stage a coup that would be anti-European and stand in the way of this. And the AK party used this very adroitly to stay in power and then to preside over an incredibly robust economy that has made Turkey aspire to be not a part of Europe anymore, but to be one of the BRIC countries, to be classed with Brazil, Russia, India, and China because of its terrific economy. There is a big debate in Turkey about, is this religious government the camel's nose under the tent of some sort of Iranian tyranny, or is it a legitimate political party? And the same thing is said about the most powerful non-governmental structure in Turkey, which is a religious sect headed by a man named Fethullah Gulen, who lives in Pennsylvania. The financial power of the Hizmet, as the Gulen people call their group in Turkey, is enormous. Their support comes from the business community, particularly from interior parts of Turkey. And Their relationship with the governing party is somewhat tense. They like the president, they don't like the prime minister. And so there's continuing negotiations within Turkey about how Islam fits into the governing position, how it will fit in the future. And among the old supporters of Muslim Kemal Ataturk, this bitter conviction that Turkey is one step away from being al-Qaeda, that all Islamic government ultimately is terroristic, jihadist, and so forth, which I think is not a tenable position at all. People in this country who look at the region often think of Turkey as a model, and sometimes think of Malaysia as a model of how you can have a fairly democratic electoral system with religious political parties participating and get in a reasonable government that fits into the international situation. But there are other people who don't see it that way. And right now, when, from an American point of view, Turkey might seem to be a model for the governments of the Arab Spring, the Muslim Brotherhood doesn't want to hear that. If they're going to set up a government, they want it to be an Arab Muslim government, not something borrowed from the Turks, because then that seems to be going back to the old Ottoman Empire and Turkish domination. But Turkey is a wonderful example.
Carol, and then
It seems to me, I've studied some Islam, Andrea, and it seems like every country has its own, under Islamic law, has its own style of government. So I'm wondering, from Iran to Saudi Arabia to Egypt, and I'm wondering which has the best chance to survive the way it is right now, and why? Which do you think?
Well, look, most of the governments of the Muslim world do not have Islamic rule. They are governments that are still structured according to secular nationalist regimes that came into power in the 1950s. And the great debate is over if you restructure it in a way that would be more acceptable to the Islamic activists. How do you do that? You've had this great furor over the new constitution in Egypt. The new constitution in Egypt is almost identical to the old constitution in Egypt. It isn't a prescription for an Islamic tyranny, but people are saying, well, but it could be. And this, this fear, this is really a very powerful fear, particularly in Europe, that if Muslims come to power by legitimate elections, they will become your worst nightmare. That fear has generated various feelings that, well, if there's a constitution, the constitution has to, guarantee everybody rights, so they can't have those rights overthrown. Well, look, in the Islamic Republic of Iran has a constitutional guarantee of freedom of religion for Sunnis, Jews, Christians, and Zoroastrians, but not for Baha'is. So Baha'is are persecuted. Well, okay. Do you have to list in your constitution everybody whom you are going to permit to have freedom? Do you have to list the right of the Mormons to have missionaries, the right of the Scientologists to collect money? It's more fear that is driving the debate than really sober appraisal of what a constitution could or should be and how a constitution would function. Whether there will be a single model that comes out of it, or whether it will end up being different for a lot of different countries, we can't see that yet. And there's also, of course, the great enigma of Saudi Arabia, which is, doing just fine because it has scads of money, but it has a ruling family that have an average age of about 85, and they're going to have a big turnover, a generational turnover in that family that nobody knows how it's going to turn out. And then you have the current king who does things that are cooperative and ecumenical and broad-minded outside the kingdom. So now you have a new King Abdullah enterprise for interreligious ecumenical relations that will involve, Jews and Christians and Buddhists and Hindus and Muslims, all under the sponsorship of King Abdullah in Vienna. And then in Saudi Arabia, well, he doesn't want that to happen there. So the Saudis see the problem, but they don't know how to do it at home, and so they do it outside the country, which they have the money to do. So it's very hard to predict where it's going to go.
Yes. My question is, due to the obviously vicious brutality in which the Muslim Brotherhood has been kind of put down of late, now that they've had the opportunity to rule in some respect, do you believe that they'll bow away from power if they lose it, or will they try to enforce or try to resist any change in power?
Mm-hmm.
And is there a inner, say for instance, dialogue within the Muslim Brotherhood of whether or not religion is more important or ruling is more important? Do they see themselves as a legitimate, as you said, role of Islam to kind of counter tyranny?
Well, you have different opinions in the Muslim Brotherhood. Andrea and I were together at a conference in Jordan in 2004. There were two very prominent members of the Muslim Brotherhood who were there, who have been very prominent in the news. And when it came to the elections, one of them ran for president outside the Brotherhood, and the other one remained a spokesman inside the Brotherhood. So we know that there are splits in the Muslim Brotherhood. The buzzword that they were enamored of in 2004 was pluralism. And they kept saying up and down, if we have elections, and if we're elected, if we do not prove that we can provide good government, then we will be replaced by the electorate. And of course, some people would say, well, that's just talking to the press. The odd thing about that conference, though, was that everyone there was, except Andrea, they're all Muslims. They're all political activists. You didn't have anyone from the U.S. Embassy. You didn't have anyone from the Bush administration. They were selling this to one another rather than to some sort of public. But you still don't know. In Iran, it's a very interesting question. 2 years after the Shah left Iran, 2 years after the revolution in Iran, Iran had a constitution, a president, a parliament. It had resolved the hostage crisis. It was organizing defense of the country against an invasion from Iraq. It was suppressing internal dissidents by the Mujahideen al-Khalq. And essentially, within 2 years, they had consolidated a regime. 2 years after the Arab Spring, you have chaos. Now, some people would say, well, those are Arabs and these are Persians, and I guess, quality will tell or something like that. But there are other issues, and one of the most important ones, I think, is that in Iran, nobody intervened. Now, you didn't have anyone sort of saying, well, should we send troops or should we give arms and so forth and so on. Nobody intervened. So that everyone in the Iranian army of the rank of colonel or general, all of whom had been personally vetted by the Shah, they all were either put on retirement, executed, or went into exile. So that the Iranian military, as a prop of the old regime, simply disappears. This had terrible impact for fighting against Iraq because they couldn't do anything above the battalion level for the first year or two of the war because they didn't have anyone who had ever been trained to be a colonel or a general. But they eventually trained new officers. So you couldn't have a military that was going to be a balancing force. Compare that with Turkey, where the military is the balancing force. Less so now, but it's taken 50 years and 4 coups in order to get to where we are now. So that here you have one model where you totally change the regime. Get rid of the military, get rid of the upper class, get rid of the power brokers, close the universities and purge them. And that's what they did in Iran. In Turkey, you had gradualism and the use of the military officer corps as the balancing wheel to keep it from going anywhere the military didn't want. In the Arab Spring, largely because of foreign intervention, foreign countries like the United States and Europeans wanted to have soft landings. So you haven't had any revolution. The military officer corps are all still there. The chief may be gone, Hosni Mubarak, but his generals aren't gone. In Yemen, Ali Abdullah Saleh may be gone, but his generals aren't gone, or his cousins, or his uncles, or his brothers-in-law, and so forth. And so it appears that you are better set up in the Arab world for a Turkey sort of thing, so that if, say, a Muslim Brotherhood government tries to act in a muscular religious fashion, the army will simply stage a coup. I'd be very surprised if we do not have military coups in some of the countries of the Arab Spring over the next 5 years, because I think that when you totally change the regime, you are capable of consolidating a new regime more rapidly and more effectively than if you have a soft landing quasi-revolution in which the deep state of the old regime is really still there. And you can see in Egypt in particular the struggle that the Muslim Brotherhood is having with the old judiciary, with the old military. And sometimes the military says, well, we'll stand back and let you make errors and so you'll collapse. And then the judiciary says, well, we'll step in and, overrule this, overrule that. How well these balancing wheel things work. Some people think this is great. I've talked to some analysts who say it's really good to have the old officer corps there because it'll keep the Muslims under control, because the military won't stand for radical or tyrannical Islamic rule. On the other hand, that may lead to just to chaos. So, between Turkey and Iran, you have the uncertainties of the Arab Spring.
Okay. I was going to say, I think we should close down and maybe have individual questions now, but I see a number of questions. So again, if you need to leave, please feel free. Otherwise, I think I had one over in the corner there, yes, and then Donnie, and then we'll go from there, and then after that, I think we'll have those who would like to flee into the night. Otherwise, if I could pick up your forms on the way out, that would be much appreciated. So, why don't you go first, and then John.
Yeah.
So I don't think that the revolution after these conflicts in the Arab Spring, they all the powers to the Muslim Brotherhood, so they, can make a caliph around the whole Muslim countries.
No, I don't think that'll happen. And I agree with you that every country has specific characteristics and specific differences. And I've been trying to talk more in generalities, but this is not the time or the place to get into country by country detail. But certainly, Muslim Brotherhood existed in Egypt with strong support before the Arab Spring, and Nahda existed in Tunisia. It's not the Muslim Brotherhood, it's a different group. But every country has a different story.
I was wondering what your thoughts were on the recent OIC summit in Egypt, and whether you thought that was something that was productive and gave direction for the Muslim Brotherhood and the rise of Islamic law, or if that's just something that keeps...
The OIC, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, is this big national membership organization that has been extremely dynamic over the last 5 to 8 years, whatever it is, under the leadership of Egmeldin Ihsanoglu, who's the General Secretary. His term is coming to an end, and he cannot succeed himself. And the general balancing, probably the next General Secretary will be from West Africa. And his predecessor was not very active, and there's no particular reason to assume that his successor will continue the level of activity that he has shown. So I think the OIC is a very unpredictable organization, because what it does is so much a manifestation of the personality and the ambition of the General Secretary. Not that Ihsanoglu has a very dynamic personality, but he does have a lot of ambition. And we'll see who comes next. I think then we'll be able to tell more.
Maybe one more question? No, have we exhausted it? Oh, great. Greg, you can ask later. In orange.
You spoke generally of Islamic political theory, Islamic government. Where is the intersection of the Shiite versus Sunni dynamic as it relates to talking of generalities of Islam?
That's about an hour.
Yeah.
It's
just interesting to me because
No, many of the structural problems of how to deal with problems in the faith that Sunnis are facing now were faced by the Shiites 150 years ago. And they set up a system where they had certain people who are recognized as top authorities, and everyone else is obliged to choose one of those people as his or her personal guide. In Sunni Islam, you follow whomever you like. It's right after 9/11, about maybe 4 weeks later, Time magazine had this sudden epiphany when they realized they didn't know beans about Islam. And so they decided to remedy this by bringing in some specialists and having them spend a half day meeting with the editors of Time to explain what Islam was. For my sins, for I don't know why, I was one of the ones brought in. I was the only non-Muslim in the group. And it wasn't terribly profitable, but the one thing that was interesting was a question I brought up, because the Time editors weren't asking it. I said, where does authority lie in the Sunni Muslim world today? And the man from Saudi Arabia said, well, that's easy. It's with the judges and the jurisprudence appointed by Muslim governments, and then they're the authorities. No problem about that. Then you had a man from India and another one from, where was the other one from? Can't remember. Anyway, you had two more who spoke, and they said, well, it varies from place to place where authority lies. And then you had a Palestinian from London. He said, the leader of the community is whoever the Shabab think is their leader. The Shabab meaning the guys on the street. And so you had, just among 4 Muslim sources, one that had the conservative view that it's the qadis and the muftis established by the government, another one saying it's the person who has the loyalty and the allegiance of the guys on the street, basically the Al-Qaeda answer. And within Sunni Islam, this is a huge problem, the nature of authority. Whereas Shiite Islam reached a pretty workable solution. The solution probably has to be redone for modern circumstances, but it does mean that the Shiites are way ahead of the Sunnis in dealing with the religious political issues.
Well, great. Well, thank you so much for joining us this evening. If you have questions, I'm the chauffeur, and we'll be happy to stay around for individual questions for a while later. Also, again, I see a few attractive brownies that would like to go to good homes, and also some lemon and raspberry bars that would like to go to good homes. So please feel free to take one more or some more on your way out. And again, if you have these forms, if you could pass them to me on your way out. But thank you.